Well, good evening. Good evening and a great welcome to the Blavatnik School of Government. I'm Ngaire Woods and I'm Dean of the Blavatnik School. A welcome to those of you in the room, a welcome to those of you on the bleachers. It's there for the young, fit ones, and I can see you're all young and fit, so welcome to you. And then welcome to those of you standing and to those of you who are joining us online. We're delighted to have you here this evening. At the Blavatnik School of Government, every year in the week of Holocaust Memorial Day, we host an event to commemorate the day and the name of Alfred Landecker, a man who represents so many who died in the Holocaust. A German Jewish man born in 1884, who made his life in Mannheim. When he moved to Mannheim, it was recognized as a city which welcomed everybody, in which a Jewish man like Alfred Landecker could avail himself of jobs and business opportunities. In 1922, he married a Catholic woman, and they had 3 children, Emily, Gerda, and Willy. He sadly lost his wife, who died at a very young age, and brought his 3 children up, helped by a housekeeper. But life for that warm, loving, joyful family became incredibly difficult, as in the 1920s, the Nazi Party began to make its path to power in Mannheim. It started with propaganda against Jewish people, against leftists. It became, in 1933, more dangerous, when with just 29% of the votes, think about that, with just 29% of the votes, the Nazi Party were able to launch a crackdown on Marxists and Jews in the city, cleansing the city administration, unleashing marches of hundreds of SS members through the city to invoke fear in the citizenship. And by 1938, Alfred Landecker, like all Jewish men, was required to add the name Israel to his name to increase the exposure and identification. It was part of a process of dehumanizing parts of the population. It was part of a process of othering them. And that othering of people was the subject of Professor Dan Diener, who's here this evening, of his Alfred Landecker lecture a few years ago. That process opened up human behavior of the worst kind, the kind that was captured in the brilliant Oscar-winning film that was sponsored by Len Blavatnik and that we showed last year, The Zone of Interest. Forbidden to immigrate with his family in 1942, Alfred Israel Landecker, at that point, not by his choice, wrote a heartbreaking farewell letter to his children, urging them to learn languages, to stay safe, and to stay good and kind. He was then arrested, deported, and died, likely in one of the extermination camps. And that story is why we are all here tonight. And we're very honored to have with us some of the descendants of Alfred Landecker, who, just as his beautiful letter to his children wrote, have made their lives, speak many languages, and have rich lives. The lesson for us here at the Blavatnik School of Government is about how we can strengthen the restraints on the abuse of power, on those who would dehumanize and abuse minorities, how we can increase the possibility that every community in the world is governed in a way that lets all human beings reach their potential. And that's becoming more and more difficult. Last night, just in the Blavatnik School of Government, in that lecture theatre, we had a seminar pulling together the work that the Alfred Landecker Foundation has supported this year about reducing violence in politics. We heard Rishi Sunak, the former Conservative Prime Minister in Britain, who launched the Digital Online Safety Act. We heard from Ofcom, the police, and the Electoral Commissioner on the challenges that they are facing. So this is a very timely moment for us both to commemorate Holocaust Memorial Day, but also for everybody in this room to renew, to reinvigorate their determination to keep their societies good and to prevent a return to that evil politics that destroyed the family of Alfred Landecker and so many of his compatriots. I'm particularly delighted, and we're all honored, that this year, giving the Alfred Landecker Memorial Lecture, we have Jonathan Freedland. Jonathan will be known to many of you. He's the author, under his own name, or his nom de plume, Sam Bourne, of some 12 books. He's the past winner of the Orwell Prize for Journalism. He's a columnist, a broadcaster. He's written plays. His play, Jews in Their Own Words, was performed at the Royal Court Theatre in 2022. His most recent book, The Escape Artist, which he's going to treat us to a description of and share his reflections on tonight, was listed as it came number 2 on the Sunday Times bestseller list. It was shortlisted for the Baillie Gifford Prize, the Rathbone Folio Prize, the Waterstone Book of the Year, and in the United States, it won 2 of the National Jewish Book Awards. Jonathan is celebrated for his thinking, his writing, his creativity in his novels and plays, and for a deep passion for making our society better. Jonathan, there couldn't be anyone better to give this year's Alfred Landecker Memorial Lecture and event. Thank you for joining us, if I can call you to the stage. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Ngaire, for that very warm introduction, and thanks to all of you. It is a very great honor to be here at the Blavatnik School, but also in memory of Alfred Landecker. I think it was Professor Diener who had described him as not one of the iconic figures of German Jewish history, not somebody famous as a great poet or scientist or engineer, but in some ways an ordinary Jew. And that is true too of the man I'm going to be speaking about tonight, that these were people who were ordinary, who were thrown into an extraordinary series of events. And from those events, I hope that we are able to shed some light on some of the dilemmas we have in our world today. And I think in the particular story that I'm hoping to share with you tonight, I think there are some, not just resonances, there are some urgencies in his story for our world now, which I was getting an inkling of when I began on this journey, but I'm more certain of now as the time has passed. So this story, I'm going to say this works. This story begins for me in 1986, when I was 19 years old. It means I'm very nearly 58, to spare you doing the mathematics. Let's see, there we are. It begins, my involvement with this begins in this place, in a darkened room in the Curzon Cinema in London, where, as a 19-year-old, I was there to see a documentary film that is 9.5 hours long. So, slightly strange teenage pastime, I grant you. It was divided up into 2 halves. They would show it sometimes, in consecutive days, 4.5 hours, then 4 hours. The film was Shoah by Claude Lanzmann. A lot of people think it is the greatest documentary film ever made. People debate it whether it is the greatest film on the Holocaust ever made. I would say it is. It's a very unusual film in that it tells this story of the past without any archive pictures. There's no footage except what was then very contemporary. The film came out in 1985. Landsman, a French filmmaker, contemporary and friend of Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir. He had himself been in the French Resistance. He was a very interesting man. He worked on the film for 12 years, and the film was consisted of interviews with people who had witnessed, survived, witnessed, and in a couple of cases, perpetrated the Holocaust. He wanted to hear from them directly. Sitting in the cinema at age 19, to me it was what I thought I was looking at was the succession of old, grey, almost entirely men, is what I thought I was looking at. I now realize a lot of these old grey men were younger than I am now, but that is what it looked like to me, until suddenly, sort of erupting onto the screen in this explosion of charisma, came this man. There he is on the right, Landsman's on the left. The man introduced in the film as Rudolf Werber is on the right there in that tan leather coat. He's in New York City. All the other interviewees in the film tended to be in, some of them were in Israel, a lot of them were in Ukraine or Poland or Russia or Germany or then Czechoslovakia. He's in New York City. He's very tanned. He's got a full head of dark, kind of lustrous hair. He seems a generation younger than everyone else who's been bearing witness in this film. And that's partly because he is. He's much, much younger. And he has a kind of fierce charisma on screen. He looks a bit like, Al Pacino in Scarface or something there with the leather coat and everything. But he's got great charisma. Landsman's interested in him, not for the obvious reason, because this man, Rudolf Werber, it is mentioned that he is one of a handful. And people debate whether, it depends on how you count, whether it's 4, 7, 9, but a handful of Jews who escaped from Auschwitz. It is a vanishingly small category. It was the hardest place in wartime Europe to escape from, to be a Jew in Auschwitz. There were escapes from Auschwitz. Polish prisoners, Soviet prisoners of war, in their scores escaped, but Jews essentially did not escape. And yet this man did. And age 19, I didn't know much, but I knew enough to know that was rare and extraordinary. As it happens, that isn't really Landsman's main interest. Landsman almost mentions that as an aside. The main reason why he wants to speak to Werber is that Werber is a kind of ultra witness, a sort of uber witness of Auschwitz. He had been in the camp for 22 months. As you know, the life expectancy of a Jew in Auschwitz was measured for the overwhelming majority in hours, and for the small group, 5, 10%, who were selected for slave labor, 2 or 3 months. To have been in there for that long was exceptionally unusual. Moreover, in the course of those 22 months, and this is why Landsman had tracked him down and wanted to talk to him, Werber had been, as a slave, in almost every part of Auschwitz. And therefore, and this was the focus of Landsman's film, Landsman was obsessively interested in the process, meticulous in tracing the exact process of annihilation. And Werber had been a witness to almost every stage of it, with the exception of the ultimate stage. He had gone up to the doors of the gas chambers. He had never been one, and there were people who, as you know, Sonderkommando, whose forced slave work was inside. He never did that. So who is this man we're talking about at the time we're talking about him? There he is, age 19, just 19 years old. He's in the uniform of a partisan in the Slovak resistance in late 1944. We'll come on to that. He was not born Rudolf Werber. He was born Walter Rosenberg. His name would change twice in his life. The first time is for a reason that Ngaire referred to. Just as Alfred Landecker had to become Alfred Israel, So Walter Rosenberg became Walter Israel Rosenberg. But he was born Walter Rosenberg to a pretty Orthodox Jewish family in the Slovak provinces, countryside. His father died when he was very young. He'd owned a sawmill. His mother was a single mother who had to raise him pretty well alone. She was a saleswoman, seamstress. She made ladies' underwear and would travel around selling it with little Walter trailing behind her until he showed exceptional sort of academic ability. And she realized he was very, very bright. The story was told at age 2. He was reading a newspaper that in his one-room village school. He was already teaching the kids 4 or 5 years older than him. And so stage by stage, he was first of all sent actually to an orphanage, in the care of his grandparents by then, and ultimately to a gymnasium, a quite elite school in the capital, Bratislava, where he was beginning to get an education that was sort of fit for him. And in the book that Ngaire referred to, The Escape Artist, you can see a photograph there of him in this kind of class photograph, the same very sort of fierce dark eyebrows for the academic year 37, 38. And then by the time 38, 39 comes, he's not in the photograph. He, like other Jews in Slovakia, were told, you are no longer welcome here. This was as early as 38. Often when you say that, people assume, so Slovakia must have been German-occupied at this point, or Nazi-occupied. Obviously, then German Nazis had come in to Slovakia and compelled the population to exclude their Jewish population. That is not the case. Slovakia had its own. It was autonomous by then. It was governed as a sort of autonomous region. It had its own fascist government who prided themselves on almost outstripping the German government in Berlin in their persecution of the Jews. And there was a front page of a Slovak newspaper whose headline was, "There are no more severe restrictions on Jews anywhere in Europe than in Slovakia." It was a boast that they were doing this and outstripping the pace setters in Germany. So it meant that Walter, as he then was, could not go to school. He meets up again with his mother, having been in a sort of boarding school, and they go to the provincial town of Trnava, and there he is just sort of mooching around. He's just he's born in 1924, he's 14 with the other Jewish kids in the town. They're wandering around, teaching themselves more or less because they're not allowed to go to school. And bit by bit, they would gather at the village green. There was a pin board there, bulletin board, where the new restrictions on Jews were posted. It felt like each day there would be something new, that they weren't allowed to have sports equipment. They weren't allowed to have a wireless. They couldn't listen to the radio. They couldn't get on a train. They couldn't get on a taxi. They couldn't own property. They couldn't own a business. The restrictions were increasing day after day until eventually, landing on the doormat of the home he shared with his mother, came the latest instruction, which was to meet at a certain time at a certain place to be deported. And at this point, Walter, who until then had been pretty sort of pliant, said, well, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to go somewhere else. It was 1942, he would have been 17 then, in the February, March. I'm not going to do that. I am from this country, I speak Czech, I speak Slovak, it says that on my passport, or my identity card, I'm a citizen. I'm not going to do it. And he begins the first of his series of escapes. And I call the book The Escape Artist because he did it several times in his life. There's the big one, but there are more later in his life, and there are earlier. And I'll spare you the detail of that, but he has an ambition of getting to London, and he thinks he'll somehow manage to walk across occupied Europe and get to London. He doesn't, of course, and he's caught in one place, he escapes from there, he's sent somewhere else, and eventually he is put on a train to the camp at Majdanek. And I don't know if anybody's seen this new film, A Real Pain, with Jesse Eisenberg. They visit there the camp of Majdanek. That is where, for 12 days, young Walter Rosenberg was, age 17 in 1942, until somebody said, look, we need volunteers to work in the outdoors, to go to a different camp. Who volunteers? Rosenberg puts his hand up straight away because he's obsessed with escape, and he thinks if I'm outside, there'll be a chance to escape. So he and 400 others are herded onto a train until he arrives at this place. And he is relieved when he sees this, because the buildings are made of brick, whereas in Majdanek they were flimsy buildings made of flimsy wood. There are proper laid paths, whereas in Majdanek it'd just been mud tracks. And above all, he sees this slogan, and he's taught himself lots of languages, so he knows enough German to know that work makes you free. And he thinks, I'm 17 and I'm strong, I can work. Things are looking up, is what he thinks, when he arrives on the last day of June 1942 in Auschwitz. That is where he is. And straight away, as he's expected, he is put to work, and he bounces around a series of work details, unbelievably hard work. One that is, backbreaking, where you are carrying cement, parcels of cement on your back, running, because at any moment there will be a blow from either the SS or their henchmen, the capos. It's backbreaking work, but he gets a very lucky break. He gets sent to the part of Auschwitz where all the prisoners, those who are selected for work, want to be, the place the prisoners called Canada. This is Canada. Now here, the job, he doesn't understand what he's doing at first, but the job is to sort through piles and piles of stuff. Suitcases, blankets, there are also piles of pots and pans, clothes, men's clothes, women's clothes, children's clothes. And his job is, particularly with the suitcases, to run back and forth, taking them to the warehouses, and there are like 6 warehouses, where other prisoners, usually women, are sorting through everything and putting them into piles. And he's working at the double, and just doing that job and making sure he keeps up the pace and isn't whipped takes up most of his attention. And he later in life admits, almost guiltily, that it takes him a while to realize where he is and what he is handling. He says later that I had vague suspicions of what this was, but slowly the penny drops, which is, he looks at all this stuff, and he looks at the prisoners around him, and he realizes these two things don't quite fit, because I can see men's clothes and women's clothes, but I can see children's clothes, and there are no children. And I can see pots and pans, but there are no homes. I can see prams, piles of prams, but there are no babies. And it's only then, weeks into his time in Auschwitz, that he realizes that he is in a place that has never existed in human history before. He is in a factory of death. The reason why there are children's clothes but no children is because they have been killed. The reason why there are clothes that clearly belong to older people, but there are no older people around, is because they have been murdered. And it's very, very slow realization. And I mention that particularly because as we're going to come on to talk about the notion of Holocaust denial, the Holocaust denial was going on even when it was happening. That people were not aware of what they were witnessing as it was happening. I'll say more about that. But even he, inside Auschwitz, it took him a while to realize what was going on. He works in Canada for several months. He gets a very important realization there. A penny drops for him, besides the obvious one, that he is in a place the like of which in human history has not existed before, an industrialized killing center. He also realizes something else, that they are going through all this stuff for commercial reasons. That all of this stuff is going to be sorted and arranged and then sent back to Germany for use. That the clothes will be repurposed in some ways. That one of the jobs is removing the yellow star from coats and jackets so that they can be usable. Everything will be used. And one of the things he discovers, it's not his job, it's a job of some of those sorters, those women, that the reason why they go methodically through every suitcase, for example, is they are looking for things that might be hidden. Jewelry, cash, maybe a diamond, that the person packing it was putting it there as a potential insurance policy, that this would be something they would be able to use. All of that wealth, those jewels, are methodically sorted and put in buckets for the jewellery, suitcases for the cash, and at the end of each day they are collected and sent once a week to the treasury in Berlin. It's not to say some of the SS men don't rake off some for themselves, they do. But he realized this is an economic business, this is a commercial hub that he is working in, and absolutely everything will be used. He works there for 8 or 9 months until he then moves to this place. That it's hard to see from that photograph, but on the right there is a railway track, and this place was known as the Alte Judenrampe, the old Jew ramp. Ramp meaning like railway platform. It was here that the trains would come in. And each train that would come in, bringing in Jews from all over Europe, from France or Holland or Italy or Germany or other parts of Poland, they would come first there. There would be a detail of people, prisoners, who would immediately take off the people off the train, prioritizing, again, because this was a big business, this was commerce, prioritizing getting their bags off first. They would be formed a big pile, then you'd get the people off. One of Rudy's jobs was to check there were people, that there was no one either dead or dying still in those carriages. Remember, these were cattle trucks, goods trains. They were jammed with people. When the doors would open, that was often the first breath the people inside had in 36, 48, 72 hours. They would sort of tumble out. It was stinking. There was no sanitation. There had been no food or water. They were starved and in sanitary conditions. And there would always be some dead in every truck. His job was to get those people off. And he did that for 10 months straight, night after night. The transports would often arrive at night. They would vary. Sometimes there could be 5 in a single night. There would be kind of Klieg lights, powerful lights on, so it could be as bright as if it was noon. One witness recorded that. On that railway platform, bright sort of television-style lights, so that everyone could see. And those people, dazed, confused, and often grateful, by the way, because compared to being in the cattle truck, compared to being in, say, a ghetto where they were before, they thought maybe this is better. But the important point was the realization that dawned on Rudy. Remember, at Canada, he had that realization that this is a killing center. Here, he has this realization that, just as he had been when he arrived, the people getting off these trains, without exception, have no idea where they have arrived. Not one. He was doing that job for 10 straight months. He's testified again and again that nobody had any idea what fate awaited them. They weren't terrified by the word Auschwitz, as we somehow perhaps imagine they would be. The people he saw came off and thought they were beginning a new life. They had been resettled in the East. It was against their will. This is not what they wanted. But maybe now at last their ordeal would be over and they would be allowed to start building a new life and a new Jewish community. That is why they had brought with them pots and pans and blankets, like we saw in the photograph before. That is why they had brought children's textbooks and exercise books and books. They thought they were starting a new community. And he understood 2 things that would be crucially important. The first one was he realized this wasn't just an accident. The reason these people had no idea where they'd arrived to was they had been lied to at every possible stage of their journey. Back when they were in the ghettos, they would receive letters from people who had gone before that appeared to say everything is fine, that we are actually starting this new life and we can't wait to see you. The recipients of those letters had no idea that the letters had been written under duress, often at gunpoint or pain of death. There were the odd clues that unsettled people from the prisoners who wrote them would try and somehow convey that there was something not right. So people would get a letter which says, as you can imagine, Mother and I are very happy to be here. And they would look at it and think, but our mother died 5 years ago. Why are you referring to... Or they would say, it's wonderful, every day we eat like Yom Kippur. A clue that the prisoners were trying to convey, but most people did not dwell on that. Because at every stage, as they got off the train, the SS, if there was time, they would often make a big show of saying, my word, what terrible state you're in. Those Slovak barbarians who've put you on this train, well, that will change now. And people thought they were now in the hands of the Germans, the most civilized, cultured nation in Europe. Things were bound to be better, and the SS would absolutely play on that and say, you've had a terrible journey, things are going to be better now. And that would go on, by the way, right until the last possible moment. So they would be, as you know, on the platform, that platform, they would be divided into, first of all, divided into columns with men on one side, women on the other, women and children under 16. And then a process of selection would happen. Often one person, famously Joseph Mengele, the doctor who became known as the Angel of Death, but there would be other more junior doctors who would sometimes sitting, sometimes with a sort of cane or a stick, and sometimes just with a finger, left, right, left, right. To the right meant you were selected for slave labor. Another form of annihilation, actually. It was known as annihilation through labor, where for 2 or 3 months you would be used as a slave. But if you were sent to the left, you were sent to the gas chambers. And that would be instant. You would be dead within an hour or two of arriving. The people sent to the left would be anyone deemed old, and that was really about over 40. Anyone too young, that was really about under 16. And anyone seen as being infirm. Women were very often, even if they were over 16 and under 40 and were fit, they were often sent to the left because they were with children, and the SS did not want a big emotional scene of separation. Now, why did they not want that scene? That is the second of the great realizations. Young Walter Rosenberg, just turning 18, had. He realized this deception was not some kind of macabre, sick joke. And I think often when we hear about these details, we think there is something, a sort of almost black humor about it, the way that as they were led up to the gas chambers and they were told to undress, they were told to keep their shoes together, tie your shoes together left and right so that you will be able to find the pair later. As they were walking to the gas chamber, they would be asked, what's your occupation? What's your trade? That's very important, but make sure you see me afterwards. You're right, we need people who are mechanics, good. Even as they were ushered into the gas chamber in crematorium 2, it wasn't in all of them, but in that one, in gas chamber 2, the fake shower heads that are very famous, as if they were going to have a shower to be disinfected. This level of deception went on all the way and at every stage. Why? The great moment of realization that would change his life was that Walter Rosenberg realized this was an absolutely deliberate strategy. Indeed, it was essential to the Nazi strategy, because in order for this process to happen smoothly and efficiently, the people going through it had to be compliant. They had to be calm and compliant. If they panicked, the whole smooth running of the system would break down. And there was another transport coming in 45 minutes or an hour. They needed calm. It was absolutely essential. To get that calm, they needed their victims to be in ignorance of what was about to happen. As Rudy would himself put it very, unsettlingly later, he would say, Walter Rosenberg as well as Rudolf Weber as he would become, he would say, it is much easier to kill sheep than to hunt deer. What he meant by that was sheep going through an orderly sort of column into the slaughterhouse, there is a system. Deer, having to shoot them at random on the hillside, is very difficult and time-consuming. And therefore, they wanted order and compliance. And so the deception was integral to the Nazi method. At that moment, like a sort of light bulb going above his head, he realized, he's 18 years old, he's a teenage boy, and he realizes the only way to slow down. I'm not even sure he thought that I can stop this, but the only way to slow down the SS killing machine is to tear away that veil of ignorance behind which the Jews of Europe are currently held. If they have information, if they have knowledge, that is the only possibility they have to break this almost, Henry Ford-style production line that the Nazis have constructed. Now, he was not naive. He didn't think that once I tell people there'll be a heroic uprising or revolt. He looked at these people. They were children. They were the elderly. They were sick. They had no arms, no weapons. He did not delude himself. But he thought if they know what is about to happen, and all these people have no idea, then maybe they will panic. There'll be a stampede. There'll be chaos, and that will at least throw some sand in the gears of the Nazi killing machine. So he decides, with the tremendous, inspiring arrogance of youth, he decides that somebody has to get out and convey the facts of this situation to the Jews of Europe. He realizes that. He decides that somebody might as well be him. And so he sets about doing two things. First, he obviously has to construct an escape plan. I won't tell you the details of how he did that. It's extraordinary. But the other thing he does is he has to absorb the information. So he memorizes what is going on around him. It's a feat of memory. I toyed with calling this book The Memory Man. It's an amazing thing in which he commits to memory every transport he sees, the point of origin, the date, the time, the estimated number of Jews on it, and he matches them with the serial numbers of those people who are picked off each transport who become prisoners. The serial numbers, of course, being the numbers that are tattooed on the forearms of those people who are selected for slave labor. Those people who were murdered in gas chambers never had a tattoo. He memorizes all that information. He devises an escape plan. It is ingenious. I'm not going to tell you how he did it, partly because, maybe you'll read the book. But it's a brilliant bit of ingenuity in which he realizes there is a sort of hole in the Nazi defenses, not a literal gap in a fence or anything like that, but rather a flaw. He, and together with Alfred Wetzler, who's also from the same town of Trnava in Slovakia, they construct a plan to escape. It is ingenious. It requires tremendous bravery, but also brilliant sort of ingenuity. They do it. There's the telegram in which the SS in Auschwitz, with some sort of embarrassment, alert Gestapo stations all over the Nazi empire that these two men are now on the run. If you can go down about 5 lines, I think you'll see Rosenberg, Walter Israel. That's him. And then later it says Wetzler, Alfred Israel. They are now wanted men. They are on the run. Somehow they have to escape through marshes and woodland and forests and frozen streams until eventually they are going through Nazi-occupied Poland. It is, people who had warned them had said that is as hard as getting out of Auschwitz is going to be doing that. Because, of course, as Walter would later say, they had no map, no compass, and no friends. Unlike people in the resistance or Polish prisoners, there were no allies on the outside to meet them and help them. They had to do it on their own, foraging in forest. They would only go at night, not during the day. Bedraggled, sick, their feet swollen, they have managed to cross the border into Slovakia, the country they're from. Through a series of extraordinary turns, they managed to make contact with the remnant Jewish community of Slovakia, the 20-odd thousand people who've held on, and then out of them pours, particularly out of Walter, who has memorized it all, out of them pours everything he remembers, the data of death, specific transports, dates, point of origin, facts, pretty well everything we know about Auschwitz in its basic form is contained in this document. That's the English translation of a document that will become known as the Wetzler report. It's 32 single-space pages packed with facts. It has it all in there. The name of the commandant whose house is depicted in the zone of interest, Rudolf Hirsch, the tattooing, the symbols that the prisoners had to wear, the shift pattern, the roll calls, the work, and the mechanics of gas chambers, down to the name of the pesticide, Zyklon B. It's all in there. It is, at that point, the fullest, most detailed account of Auschwitz that has ever been published anywhere. It then embarks on its own escape journey. It is passed hand to hand by resistance fighters, by diplomats, journalists. It crisscrosses occupied Europe until it eventually reaches those three people, crosses the desks of Churchill in London, Roosevelt in Washington, and the Pope in Rome. They, for a whole variety of reasons, now attached to this report is a plea from the Jewish leadership based then in Jerusalem saying, here is the evidence, we need you to act, we need you to bomb the railway tracks. If Auschwitz is a factory of death, the railway tracks into Auschwitz are the conveyor belt. Bomb those railway tracks. For a variety of reasons, maybe we'll get into it in the questions, they do not bomb the railway tracks. It's partly practical reasons, we can talk about those. It's partly prejudice. There are Foreign Office diplomats who say, well, we have to allow for a degree of Jewish exaggeration when they read this report. The one Foreign Office official says to another, we've spent enough time on these wailing Jews. I would take this with a pinch of salt. There is skepticism. There's prejudice, but there is also skepticism, even when the report gets to Hungary, which is really the main destination for this report, because Walter and Alfred, Walter, by the way, now that once he's reached Slovakia, he's given a new name, new papers. He becomes Rudolf Werber, a name he keeps for the rest of his life. Once the spur for them escaping when they did, in part, is because they have got wind that a new Jewish community is about to be taken into Auschwitz, and that is the Jews of Hungary. They are the last Jewish community left that have not been pulled into the inferno. And he gets out when he does in April 1944, in part because he wants to sound the alarm about the Jews of Hungary, who he is sure are next. The report reaches the Jewish Council in Hungary. Samu Stern, president of the Jewish Council, looks at it and says, how do we know? How do we know this isn't the product of the fevered imagination of two rash young men? He cannot believe the document he is holding in his hand, and together with other Hungarian Jewish leaders, we might talk about this later, they never do distribute that warning to the Jews of Hungary. By mid-May, the deportations from Hungary have begun, and in a 56-day period, 437,000 Jews from Hungary will be deported and sent. The overwhelming majority will be murdered in Auschwitz. It is the most intense period of the whole Holocaust. The D-Day landings have happened. Everyone thinks the war is nearly over. In Auschwitz alone, and remember it's one of only 5 death camps, 12 to 15,000 Jews are being killed every single day. It is at absolutely its most intense pitch. For the rest of his life, Rudolf Werber, as he now was, would be bitter and angry at those who did not pass on or who did not heed his warning. He believed those Jews of Hungary could have had a chance to save themselves if only they had known. But he was hard on himself because the report he wrote did make it to not just these 3 people you see here, but it did make it to, eventually, a journalist, British journalist, in Zurich, who managed to, because their censorship laws were different, who managed to publish a summary of this story. And then, in June of 1944, it was out there that this is what Auschwitz was doing. Suddenly, Churchill, Roosevelt realized that what they know is now known by their publics, and suddenly they act in a way they hadn't done until then. They write to the leader of Hungary, the regent Miklos Horthy, and say, when we win this war, Roosevelt says, when we win this war, we will bring to account those who are implicated in the annihilation of the Jews. Horthy, ruler of Hungary, thinks, I'm going to be for it, panics, and at that point orders the deportations to stop. At that point, the Jews of the provinces of Hungary, 437,000 of them, are dead. But the Jews of the capital city, Budapest, have not yet been killed. And on that day, July the 6th, the deportation stop. Literally, the train is on its way to Auschwitz. It stops and turns around, comes back. As a result, nearly 200,000 Jews of Budapest who would have been deported and sent to their deaths in Auschwitz were not. That is because of the work of the man you see on the left. He, together with Fred Wetzler, managed to, I believe, was instrumental in the saving of 200,000 Jewish lives. It is why I believe he belongs alongside Primo Levi or Anne Frank or Elie Wiesel as one of the iconic figures of the Shoah period. It is why I believe he is a towering figure of this story. He did this age 19. His story has great relevance for us now because the lesson that I think he teaches us is that the difference between truth and lies can be the difference between life and death. He understood that, age 19. He also understood that information, having it, can save a life, but it is not on its own enough. He gave the information to the leaders of Hungary, but they did not act on it. As he later would understand, it's not enough to have the information, you have to believe it. And that is a huge challenge to all of us with the challenges we face now. I think he's a towering figure. I'm very glad you've joined me this evening in remembering him. Thank you very much.
While we reset the stage, you can be thinking of what you would like to ask Jonathan or a very brief comment that you would like to make. I think that's our moment now. But Jonathan, let me open with your last remark about what we learn about this today. Tim Snyder has written a book on tyranny, and he says the number one thing that we must know as citizens about preventing tyranny is the consequences of what he calls anticipatory obedience, pre-complying. Because he says it doesn't just make it easy for the tyrant, but it trains the tyrant to go even further. I think it's I don't know, this is clearly something you've been thinking about, but lessons for our time about this kind of tyranny?
I mean, there are so many, and I think we're sometimes very nervous about drawing those lessons because the fear we have, which is right, is that by referring to anything now, we are somehow saying it's the same as that, and therefore, you know, the difficulty of this is, on the one hand, you want to preserve the singularity of these events, which are, a degree of a gravity that is unlike anything else. And on the other hand, you don't want them to be in a remote place where you can never draw any lessons from them. So I think we absolutely must. And I think the centrality of, information and knowledge in Rudy's story, but in where we are now. So Timothy Snyder has, as you said, talked about this anticipatory obedience, but he mentioned it recently in the context of, it's a completely different context. And I absolutely am not one of the people saying that this is the same. But when you look at the people who control our information space now, the leaders of the tech companies, who with almost very little threat yet, but believe they must fall in with, a returned President Trump and do whatever he would want them to do, there is that impulse which says we have to bend the knee before we are even made to bend the knee. And so, Google Maps today saying we're going to call it the Gulf of America, not the Gulf of Mexico, which they have said today. That's a bad habit because it does mean that those people, first of all, it's bad in itself. These are the people who do control the information space. Facebook and Google and social media, X and so on. That's worrying. But it's more the impulse which is to say, rather than wait to be forced to do something, we're going to do something. in a way, you know, my reason why I perhaps partly mentioned the point about Slovakia were eventually occupied. But as far as the Jews of Slovakia were concerned, they'd already had the trouble because there was anticipatory compliance, if you like, by the fascist government of Slovakia who did what the Germans wanted of them before there were any Germans. In fact, they, you know, it's extraordinary, they paid the Germans to deport their Jews. 500 Reichsmarks per person, with a guarantee, by the way, from the Germans that the Jews in question would never be allowed to come back. So therefore, Slovaks could take the homes of their Jewish neighbors. The point is that there is this kind of, I think we imagine these things are always with coercion, and they're not. Often there is a sort of dance where one side guesses what the other one wants it to do and does it in advance.
Thank you, Jonathan. Your questions or comments? It's a remarkable silence. Right here. There's a microphone just coming to you, Julia. And do introduce yourself to the...
Thank you. Fascinating, and I really enjoyed the book, actually, which I'm afraid I waited till the paperback, but I was on the list for the paperback. But one of the things I was very struck by, as you say...
Warden of Nuffield.
Julia Black, Warden of Nuffield. One of the things I was very struck by, as you say, was first of all his prodigious memory and this very, very detailed account. But the second thing which I found very worrying was, as you say, the disbelief and the skepticism with which actually true information was greeted. And I wonder if you just want to explore a little bit more on that, because it seemed that people couldn't believe that this could possibly happen. And I think we talk a lot at the moment, obviously, about disinformation and the perils of disinformation, but actually how you get true facts through in contexts where people just think this couldn't possibly be. So how you overcome, and actually how was that disbelief overcome?
No, that's you've absolutely put your finger on it. That is, in a way, that what drew me to this subject is that, because we do put a lot of attention about the virality of false fake news, but the troubles that the truth has, I think we spend much less time on. So there's a story I tell in the book. It's not directly related to Rudy, but I think it's very important. There was an earlier, there were 2 or 3 people who brought information about the mass killings in Europe out. And one is, there's a film, Claude Lanzmann made a film about him, Jan Karski, who was a diplomat in the Polish government in exile, sort of aristocratic man, not Jewish, importantly. And he had got himself into the Warsaw Ghetto, and he'd actually seen some of these deportations. He had no idea about Auschwitz, but he knew about others. And he saw Anthony Eden in London, and told Eden mass killings are going on in Europe. Eden stands on his feet and leads a minute's silence in the House of Commons in December 1942, so early. And he goes to the United States, and he wants to meet Roosevelt, does meet Roosevelt. But he has a meeting with the Jewish justice on the Supreme Court, Felix Frankfurter, and he tells him what he's seen. And Frankfurter says at one point, I don't believe you. And the man who's brought him there, who's a diplomat, says, this man, Mr. Karski, comes with the highest possible credentials, I can vouch. Frankfurter puts up his hand and says, I didn't say he's not telling the truth. I said, I do not believe him. I cannot believe him. No, 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 no. Frankfurter says to Karski, I cannot believe what you're telling me. It's too awful. It's too awful to contemplate that human beings could do this. And remember, we now have the precedence. One of Snyder's points is we have an advantage over them because the 1930s and 40s have happened. But they didn't have that. They didn't conceive of such a thing being possible. And I think culturally, they didn't conceive of being possible of the Germans. And so when Rudy and Fred were briefing the people who'd taken them in, they were hiding in a basement for 2 weeks in the town of Žilina in Slovakia. At one point, they are telling everything in such detail. And one of the people interviewing them, interrogating them, says, sorry, you haven't explained to me when exactly do the Germans put these Jews they bring in on trial? Surely there is a legal process. And Rudy's 19 years old, he's thinking, there's no legal process. These people are just being murdered off trains. So this cognitive disbelief. It's hard for us now to believe it. as I had finished the draft of the book, two things happened. The first one was, really within days of me finishing it, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And there were stories that people in Ukraine were phoning their relatives in Russia, and they were saying, you know, Russian bombs are falling on us right now, listen. And they were holding the phone out the window. And their own family in Moscow was going, no, 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 I don't believe you. That can't be happening. Our television here is not saying that that's happening. You have the facts, but you have to believe them. They're different things. The second thing that happened, which is apparently more sort of trivial, but I think it was relevant, was the film Don't Look Up came out. A sort of satire on the way we don't act on the warnings on climate change. And, you know, but because I had been immersed in this story, I came at that with a different pair of eyes, because I thought it's quite true that you can set out, and scientists do set out the data every day. You can see the evidence with your own eyes in wildfires in Los Angeles or whatever, and still people don't act on it. And this is something that Rudolf Verber encountered. He believed in his 19-year-old naivety that the minute people knew, they would act. And he came away from it realizing information is not enough. People have to believe. And so I think a challenge for all of us who are engaged in anything like this, whether it's Ukraine or climate change or anything, is it's not enough to just present people the facts. People have to believe them.
Yeah, I mean, some people would say that people need the facts, but they then need an instruction on what to do. But your story, there was an instruction: bomb the rail tracks of Auschwitz. So from your knowledge, you know, you're a great observer of human beings. You're telling everyone in this room that if something's inconvenient or unpleasant for us, we're likely to want to say it's just not true. So what's the remedy you would give to everybody in this room to that?
Well, so I think it is vital that you can set out some course of action, because people's ability to believe terrible news is in some ways contingent on their ability to believe there's something they can do about it. Because if you believe there's nothing you can do and you are completely fatalistic, then I think we have self-protection mechanisms that shut down our ability to believe it. So there's a story I tell in the book about the Czech family camp, which is a really unusual and sort of odd, you know, side story. But in Auschwitz, they did maintain a camp where the conditions were much, much better, where families were allowed to stay together, mothers and fathers and children, where their hair was not shaved, where they were allowed to wear their own clothes. The people in there had no idea why they were being treated differently from everyone else. About 4,000 or 5,000 of them. It turned out they were being kept alive as a kind of showpiece, so that if the Red Cross ever demanded to inspect what is going on in Auschwitz, they would then be able to say, look, it's fine, it's just a sort of holding facility. The Red Cross never even asked to go. So they didn't need the family camp. So once the authorities in Auschwitz concluded we don't need this family camp, we might as well gas everyone in it, the children, the mothers, the fathers. And they did that. But there were two. They had arrived in two batches. So the first batch were all murdered in a single two-day period. The people in the second batch knew that that was going to be their fate. There was no doubt about it now. You've seen the people. The idea that you've been somehow handpicked for survival. At that point, you would think then there would be some kind of chaos, panic, stampede, uprising. Nothing, not a bit of it. They carried on learning, the adults were teaching the children, they carried on doing little recitals and music, because a different dynamic kicked in, which was, there is nothing we can do about this, and therefore it is better to just pretend we don't know. So any effort at advocacy or persuasion has to be linked with action. Because if you believe it's a lost cause, then actually not only will you not act, you won't even believe that there's a problem. And that's a human self-preservation. I came away from this thinking this isn't about Jews or Germans or Poles. This is a very human thing about our inability, and people will know this in their own lives. Sometimes we know there's a bad situation in our own lives, and we choose not to know it and not to see it. And that can happen on a collective scale, it can happen on a global scale. And Rudy's story, I think, bears that out. So if you're in any kind of position, don't think you've done the job just by conveying the information. You have to attach it to action, I think.
Irene?
That was just absolutely terrific. Thank you, Jonathan. I mean, just to... Irene Tracy, Vice-Chancellor here. I mean, a lot of what you say, I think, bears truth in the context of what we understand about how people make decisions. We tend to think of ourselves as rational decision makers, but actually what we know is really we make decisions more on an emotional level, and that's been born. I'm a neuroscientist by background. And this sense of agency, if you can't, you sort of have a learned helplessness if you feel it's too difficult to challenge. So bringing that narrative and that storytelling with beyond the facts, as you say, you could go to any topic, you know, climate being one, the one that you've just beautifully illustrated tonight. Somehow we've got to get the story with that emotional element so that we feel it at a very connected, relational way, because that's how humans as animals, as social animals, then can make the decision. I think it is very core and very old. And, you know, the role of journalism in getting that right couldn't be more important than now. But my question more to you is, this is obviously a remarkable individual. I mean, you know, the story is great, and I will buy the book and read it. Thank you, Julia, for the good review. What was it that you learnt about him that you would say, you know, maybe some of our students could learn here listening about the resilience that he had? Because he obviously had bucket loads of resilience to just survive and get through. What was it that what strategies did he have to sort of get through that?
Thank you. Really so interesting. So I'm not just saying this because I'm in a university with lots of young people, but I think his youth is so important in this. And I mentioned a couple of times that, you know, the arrogance of youth where he thinks somebody has to alert the Jews of the world, it might as well be me. I mentioned in the book, somebody spotted this, said, you keep telling us his age over and over again. You know, we already know, and I realize it was sort of unconscious, but I think it's important. For this reason, there is something that young people see that older people don't see. And it happened in the most literal way here. So I mentioned at the end there that his report was never shared among the Jews of Hungary, who in a way were for him the most important audience for it. He wanted to warn them. If he could, he'd have stood on the rooftops and shouted, "Do not get on those trains, whatever you do," right? But they never distributed the warning. But a young man who worked in the Hungarian Jewish Council saw a copy of it. He wasn't really particularly meant to, somebody showed him a copy. He immediately went to see his uncle and said, "Uncle, I now know if what's going to happen to us is we're going to be asked to get on trains, told to get on trains, and if we get on them, we're going to be killed." And his uncle got so angry with him, he sort of raised his hand to him as if to hit him. "Don't ever say such a thing. What are you saying?" And this scene, the man in question became a great scientist in Sweden, this young man, 19 as well, actually. And he made a big journey to find Rudolf Weber 40 years later to thank him. That scene was replayed again and again. Young people, when they heard this warning, acted on it. Almost always. Older people almost always did not. They found 100 reasons why not to believe it. Now, why is that? It's partly because they had too much to lose. The uncle had a business, he had a house, he had children, he had a life. The idea of saying, just get rid of all that and run, it was too hard to do that. But there is also something about, so that's one reason that sometimes we should listen to young people because for the very reason I think we don't, which is because they have less to lose in a way, that gives them a kind of authority in a situation like that. And I think they have obviously more to lose because it's the future, but they're not tied with these sort of commitments that I think held back people. But the other thing is a kind of willingness to see what in some ways older people struggle to see because we are so used to things being the way they've always been. So how is it that he, aged 19, I think he will have an exceptional mind, Rudolf Weber, but he understood the centrality of deception on that railway platform in a way that, I've read testimonies by people who were in their 30s and 40s and 50s. They didn't see it as clearly as he did. And I don't think it's just his brilliance. I think it was his age, that he could see the world more freshly. There was something sort of open about him. And, you know, people will talk about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. It was led by people aged 19, 20, 21. I don't think those things are just coincidental. And I do wonder whether, I'm all for listening to our elders and seniority and all that, but I wonder if we need to find ways to hear those younger voices. As for his resilience, here's something which I don't think we often think about. I've noticed in a lot of the commemorations that we all went through yesterday for Holocaust Memorial Day, it happens less now because there are so few Holocaust survivors left. But there is a dynamic. My colleagues in the media, when you interview a Holocaust survivor, you treat them like a kind of saint, and you expect them to have tremendous moral, not just wisdom, but kind of encouragement. We expect them actually to console us and to tell us that in the end it was a triumph of the human spirit, and in the end people are good. You know, this quote from Anne Frank, "In the end I believe human beings are good." That quote that's used before she'd gone to her death, right? Before she'd been seen that maybe it wasn't true. We need that from them. Rudy Verber refused to be that person. I found in the archives a letter he wrote to a BBC producer who asked him to come on a documentary, and he writes to him and says, "I must warn you, I am not your cliched Holocaust survivor." It's an amazing thing to say. He knew about himself. Why was he not the cliche? Because he got angry. He was angry at those people who had done it, the Nazis, those people who had collaborated, which was all the peoples of occupied Europe, the Poles, the Lithuanians, the Latvians, the Estonians. There was nobody who didn't help. The French, who didn't help deport and round up their Jewish neighbors. But he was furious. He could never get over the people who had the warning in their hand and refused to pass it on. He could not forgive those people. His autobiography, he wrote it in 1963, was called "I Cannot Forgive." He was consumed with that anger. As a result, because people often ask me, how come I haven't heard of this man? He didn't get the invitations. He wasn't asked to speak to audiences like I've been privileged to speak to tonight, because he was really difficult. He would start going off on one and start accusing you. He would probably accuse his host tonight. He would find a reason to do that, and people would think, let's not invite him next time. He was there in Vancouver, in Canada. There's a Jewish community there. It's not massive. They would have, for the high schools, each year a symposium on the Holocaust. They would invite Holocaust survivors. They didn't invite him. And I asked the organizer, why didn't you invite him? And they said, because you never knew if, with Rudy, it wouldn't soon descend into accusations and rage.
Sorry, may I ask a question?
I'm just going to finish. Oh, you can. Let me just finish that sentence. And so he said, you didn't know if it would descend into accusations and rage, so they stopped inviting him. And the point I make about that is, we have to allow people who have endured tremendous trauma not to be these saintly, healed, consoling figures. Sometimes they're going to be very angry. And the last example of it, I had that thought myself when I watched again my colleagues in the press when Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe gave her first press conference. She wasn't giving them the answers they wanted because she wasn't just sort of peace, love, and harmony. She was angry. We have to allow room for that for people who've gone through great trauma. It's part of their resilience.
I'd like to give the last question in the school to one of the students in the Blavatnik School of Government. Do introduce yourself and put the question.
I'm a Holocaust survivor from the 8th of July, 1944, when I was on the final ramp to go to Auschwitz. Maybe I can ask a question.
Where you go, sir, and then I'll turn it to Marius, and then we'll close. So do ask your question,
yes.
and then we'll take...
I think it was a fascinating talk. I think towards the end, it was oversimple. That the matter of his saving 200,000 lives, the idea that on the 6th of July, the deportations stopped, is not true. I don't remember it because it's 80 years ago, but I was in the camp at Budakalash, waiting with the deportations, the same place that Imre Kertész, the Nobel Prize winner, was on that same place. there was a deal with Eichmann, of which I was one of under 100 who was negotiated away. About 11,000 were sent to Auschwitz. This was continuing after Horthy had given the instruction to stop the deportations. My first cousins were deported considerably after that, Wesenmayer and Eichmann didn't go along with it. There was, in August of 1944, they were going to start the deportations again, and it was actually only because Romania went out of the war that they didn't continue. I think that the only thing that I would question from what you are saying is that you do have to give a general story, which you do brilliantly. Historically, the history is extremely complicated, and there is a tendency to say things that, if you examine them, are less true than seems to be. And I think that that this requires actually rather more research into certain sources that haven't been looked at now. I could go into it, have a word with you afterwards about this. But thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for being here, and thank you for your testimony.
Thank you. I can say something about that, but
Yes, I'll just take the
Take the
question from
last one,
Marius,
yeah.
and then we'll have you.
Yes, my name is Marius Gard. I'm an MPP student here at the school. My question or comment is about, you mentioned a number of times Auschwitz as a factory of death. And this very much reminded me of a poem I read in a visit to a concentration camp in Poland, in Groß-Rosen, the Todesfuge by Paul Celan, which said, death is a master from Germany. Der Tod ist ein Meister aus Deutschland. And you've mentioned now several times Slovakia's role there's anti-Semitism across Europe during that time, and Slovakia's role in the death and killing machine of millions of Jews. But I wonder, and that's a question I as a German has asked myself, and in discussion with friends and also with my grandparents, to what extent was that killing machine in the land of engineers, in the country of these famous engineers, uniquely German, and especially asking this question in light of the far-right party now in the upcoming elections closing in on 20% in Germany. Thank you.
thank you. Thanks for both of those questions. You're quite right, it's complicated, and I get into all the detail you've talked about in the book. It's hard to do it in a crunch-down talk here. The point I think is worth picking up is, once those deportations were halted, as I've set out in the book, it's not as if the Jews of Budapest were out of the woods in terms of danger, and I get into that in the book. Obviously, once Horthy was gone, the Arrow Cross took over. Deportations did then happen later on, but in that mass deportation of the Jews of Budapest that was about to happen, it was halted on the days I set out in the book. And the deal with Eichmann is a whole other story, which I do get into in great detail, but it's in there, and we would have to do it there. But it would be a privilege to speak to you later on about more of this. In terms of your question, I hoped I'd said a few times that I think it's a sort of comfort blanket to think this is peculiarly a German thing. It isn't. That's why obviously I followed the story, but I think it's helpful that the Werber story is a Slovak story. Who knew that the Slovakian government of Josef Tiso was doing this with alacrity, when no one was forcing them to do it? That they were the ones paying the Germans, saying, take these Jews out of our hands. That the first deportations of Jews anywhere were in Slovakia. But all the way through this story, there are the involvement of the nations of Europe. And it's a very, very hard thing to take that. To realize that, the collaboration, the cooperation, was not confined to one country, to Germany. So on one level, I think it is a kind of, as I say, it is a strategy to make it seem more manageable to say, well, this wasn't all human beings, this was Germany. Instead, I think this was something that is human. I mean, I think the victims were very specific in the sense they were the Jews. And I'm, one of those people who resists what I do worry about, a slight universalization where man's inhumanity to man. Well, it was quite specific. It was man's inhumanity to the Jews, and there was a determination to eliminate the Jews of Europe. But those Nazi Germans who set this thing in train had allies across Europe. So I think the Germans now have, there is a task of reckoning that Germany has set a lead on. I mean, Germany reckons with this more introspectively than almost any other country, I think. Partly because for the reasons I think you've talked about, which is others have been able to say to themselves, well, we are the victims of the Nazis, we are not the Nazis, And that has prevented a process of reckoning in Hungary and Austria and Poland and all kinds of other places. There's some, but I think Germany has led on that. But obviously, there is some deep questions Germans have to wrestle with. I think they have and are wrestling with them. But these questions go way beyond one country. And maybe that makes it easier for you, but maybe it makes it harder for everyone else. This is a universal thing, I think.
Now, if there's one message from Jonathan's brilliant talk tonight, it's that human connection, understanding without denial, listening carefully, including to the 19-year-olds in this room, is vital. And I'm going to invite you to do exactly that in a moment in the rooms behind this Inamori Forum, where there'll be drinks and food, but also an opportunity to distill and reflect on what we've heard tonight and to talk to each other, to Jonathan, to our guests. Before I do that, and before I thank Jonathan, I would like to thank the Alfred Landecker Foundation, who have made this lecture possible, who have made the Alfred Landecker Chair here at Oxford University in the Blavatnik School possible, and who are here in force along with the family who lie behind them. A very special welcome and thank you to them, as well as a thank you to the man sitting in the front row, Sir Leonard Blavatnik, whose philanthropy made this Blavatnik School of Government possible, and made all of our efforts here in the school to find, to educate, to strengthen a generation of new government leaders who will hold that wall, who will learn from the kind of history that Jonathan has just given us. With that, of course, all of our thanks to Jonathan for the wonderful book that he's put in front of us. The film is forthcoming, I believe, but for sharing tonight with such marvelous storytelling and such memorable lessons. So please join me in thanking Jonathan Freedland.